Yes, thank you. All right, good morning. All right, so this work is basically going to be a critical research synthesis um, about charter school research in the United States. And I've been working for the last 2 or 3 years with a big team of people working on a charter school effects study and this early college high school project I was mentioning earlier. So I've got lots of collaborators who have helped me develop the ideas that went into this study. So what are charter schools in the United States? I'm not sure how much you know about them, so let me just kind of lay some basic facts on the table. They emerged in 1991 as alternatives to traditional public schools, and for lack of a better term, I'm just going to call them TPS as an abbreviation. And these are the comprehensive schools that serve all comers in the United States that are based on catchment areas within school districts. The charter schools don't have catchment areas and can serve kids from many different districts within states. They face fewer requirements on hiring teachers and principals, on curriculum, instruction, length of the school day, but they face similar accountability requirements to TPS schools. They're publicly funded, but privately run, mostly by nonprofits, although there are some for-profit charters as well. There are also some virtual charter schools. And one of the key features of these schools is that families enroll by choice, not by catchment area. So of course, families choose where to live in different neighborhoods, but this gives families arguably more flexibility in where they go to school, where they send their kids to school. These schools may not charge tuition, and they may not impose admission requirements. They may market themselves as being a college prep school or a school for foster care kids or something like that, but they do have some restrictions on denying students admission based on their academic qualifications and things like that. Okay, so just a little bit about school enrollment in the U.S. These are the totals. So as of 2012-13, there are about 58 million students enrolled in schools in the United States. That represented an 8% increase from about 12 years before. And so this includes basically everything but homeschool kids, which are a very small portion of the overall population. So you can see that the two basic categories are regular public schools, public schools of choice, and then private schools. So traditional public schools, which are here called regular schools, enrollment has risen 5%, mostly due to population growth. Charter schools have grown quite a bit over 12 years, about fourfold increase. Magnet schools, which are also schools of choice but aren't charter schools, have doubled, and private school enrollment has actually declined in the U.S. over this period. So charter school students are not a large majority of, by any means, of school enrollments in the U.S., but they are a fast-growing population within the public school sector. They're in most states in the U.S. So this data is actually from it's a little bit more recent, from 2014. So now the average is about 5% rather than 4%. In some states have no charter schools at all. Those are in white. Dark blue is higher density of charter schools. So Arizona, Colorado, both, at 19 and 11% respectively. District of Columbia, the nation's capital, has almost half of the schools being charter schools. My home state of North Carolina, about 5%, which is at the nationwide average. Florida, which has a lot of large urban districts, at about 9%. And of course, the proportions in many urban areas are larger. So these districts, New Orleans, DC, Detroit, et cetera, have at least 20% of the share of public school students in charter schools. And also, charter schools are more likely to locate in urban areas than in suburban or rural areas. So they're overrepresented in urban areas. In addition, whites are underrepresented and blacks are overrepresented in charter schools relative to traditional public schools. So, there's many policy questions of interest in charter schools. One of the most interesting to me is, how do we regulate a sector that is supposed to be free of regulation? It's kind of a paradox. But if you're going to have a marketplace, you need to have some rules about the marketplace, right? Who's going to authorize charter schools? What happens when a charter school is not serving students well, and things like that. I'm going to focus on some questions about effectiveness. That's not to say that there are other very important issues like equity, cost, efficiency, and many other things. But I'm going to really focus in this paper on effectiveness, in particular on this question, which is, are charter schools on average performing better than traditional public schools? So I guess I should pause here and say, well, is this an interesting question? And perhaps it is, and it depends on how you look at it. On the one hand, perhaps there's no strong reason to think that charter schools would be any different than traditional public schools. There's no unified theory of action about what a charter school is, what it should do, what kind of students it serves, what kind of curriculum instruction it should have, or anything like that. It's a very diverse field, or it's a very diverse school type. Because there's so many different types out there, some back to basics, some progressive, some online, some profit, some nonprofit, some with extended day, some with standard days. There's really no reason to expect, a priori, a difference. On the other hand, I feel that policy should be driven by evidence. So if there's no evidence that charter schools are better, then perhaps we should stop encouraging them to form in the first place. They could be doing harm to kids, so let's end the experiment now. Or if there is evidence that charter schools are more effective, then let's encourage them and even, have them replace traditional public schools. And if there are particular charter school types that are more effective, then let's foster those and get rid of the ones that aren't doing well. It turns out that's very hard to do. Just like any traditional public school, charter schools are very hard to shut down. There are other interesting questions that I hope to have time to talk about in the paper, but not in this presentation. Such as, does effectiveness vary by state, region, and urbanicity? I think there's some evidence that it does. And is variation in school performance greater among charters than among traditional public schools? So first, what does social science theory say about why there might be an effect? So first, there's market competition theory, and this is really kind of where it all started with Milton Friedman and Chubb and Moe and others. And the idea was that we should free schools from regulation, and they will then perform better, compete with each other for students who prioritize academic performance. And so that predicts that charter schools would be better than traditional public schools, and traditional public schools will improve when faced with charter school threats. There's many questions about this theory. Are charter schools, for example, are charter schools attempting to maximize academic performance, or are they simply trying to maximize enrollment? Are families, are families able to choose schools based on productivity? Do they have the information to do that? Are charter schools creaming the skim, selecting the students that they want rather than serving all comers? So these are all, questions that scholars are raising about this market competition theory. Another theory that scholars point to is institutional theory. And that is that schooling is a highly institutionalized field in which it's very hard to innovate. Charters are free from some rules, but are still held accountable for test scores. They still must not discriminate. They've got to have teachers, schools, classrooms, etc. Schooling kind of looks the same in a lot of different countries and a lot of different sectors. A lot of the same activities, age-graded schools, age-graded classrooms, and the like. And parents and policymakers expect certain things from schools, and schools that look too different are not very likely to survive. So institutional theory would predict that charter performance probably wouldn't be that different than traditional public schools, because schooling and the institution of schooling enforces some conformity and institutional isomorphism, which would constrain innovation. So what does the evidence say? I'll just kind of cut to the chase here. There's some systematic reviews, 2 of them, and there's 2 meta-analyses. And I'm going to pull from them largely, and then I'm going to do some interpretation. These reviews, the systematic reviews end with this point. Charter schools are about equal to traditional public schools when it comes to reading achievement, and maybe a little bit better when it comes to math. I question that conclusion, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And there's very few studies of attainment, high school graduation, college enrollment, and the like. And there, the findings are the systematic reviews argue it's pretty clear cut. Charters outperform traditional public schools. I question that as well. And this last review here, this meta-analysis was a study of just no excuses charter schools, and it concludes that this type of charter school is very effective, especially given that the population is a very disadvantaged population to begin with. Now, these no excuses charter schools are going to come up a few times, so I'll just lay a little bit of, I'll try to define what it is. There's no one definition of what a no excuses charter school is, but this is how one review describes it. The number of key characteristics are high academic expectations, rigid and consistent discipline, extended instructional time, intensive teacher training, and higher parental involvement. Those are some of the design principles for these no excuses charter schools. So, but the key question is, what is the nature and quality of the evidence? And I think that's where my contribution comes in. And what I'd like to highlight in particular is differences in the studies in their internal and external validity. So what do I mean by that? Well, internal validity is whether we can draw a causal inference from the quantitative evidence from a particular sample. And yes, these are all quantitative studies. And yes, the goal of every charter school study is to draw a causal inference from the quantitative evidence in the study, although many will acknowledge limitations or threats to internal validity. That is definitely their target. External validity is whether we can extrapolate about the effects from a study based on a particular sample to either the full population or to a different sample in a different place or with a different student population and the like. And what's interesting is that most authors punt on external validity. They basically say these findings are not externally valid. Right? So when it comes to internal validity, they say we are shooting for internally valid results. We're maybe not quite getting there, but that is our aim. With external validity, very few studies attempt to even make that claim. So let's be clear about what the type, be specific about the type of errors that can emerge from threats to internal and external validity. So the main threat to internal validity is confounding error. We claim that X causes Y in our sample, but we're mistaken because the apparent effect is spurious, not causal. In other words, the effect we would get would be different if we randomized X. So again, and now I'm kind of shifting into counterfactual reasoning. The effect we would get would be different if we randomized X. Sometimes X is sort of randomized, and X, in this case, is being enrolled in a charter school. The threat to external validity is what I'll call sample selection error. So here, we claim that X causes Y in our sample, but the effect we would find in the population or in a different sample would differ. So we can think about the thought experiment. The effect we would get would be different if we randomly selected the sample to get the treatment, which is hardly ever done, by the way. So often there is a trade-off between internal and external validity. So let's have a thought experiment here. Let's try to design the perfect charter school study. Here's one version. First, we would need to randomly select charter schools from across the United States. The first step is no problem. We have a list of charter schools. I could do that in a couple of hours. The second step is to develop a list of all children who could feasibly enroll in these schools. No such list exists, so it would be very expensive to do this. We have lists of public school students, but not all students are in public schools in the United States, and there's no list of all students. You'd have to do a household survey of some sort. The third step is we'd need to randomly assign from this list of all children to either go to a charter school or a nearby traditional public school. And very few families would agree to this random assignment scheme. And charter schools are supposed to be schools of choice, so that would sort of violate the whole idea. And then ideally you'd ensure that both treatment and control students adhere to their assignment and track them long enough to gather outcome measures, which would be very hard. So this has never been done, right? Something close has been done, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but nothing that, and this is the type of design that would have very good internal validity and very good external validity as well. So let's characterize the research base. We can put external validity on the y-axis, internal validity on the x-axis. So this is high internal validity and high external validity. And so you want to be out here. There are many of these type of studies, which I'll call fixed effect studies. This is where we kind of started with this research in the early 2000s. And these are so-called fixed effect studies. That's just my kind of shorthand for talking about them. It's based on panel data analysis methods for longitudinal data. These are based in states or districts, and they've been done in many different states and districts. I'll summarize them in a minute. They're observational studies, not experiments. And there's been many different authors, including Sunny Ladd, right here, who's done many of them. And I would say these have, pretty good internal validity and pretty good external validity, but there are studies that have higher internal validity. We then started doing lottery-based studies because people were criticizing the fixed effect studies, and but they were done in only a few areas, and they were predominantly a particular type of charter school. Actually, the first lottery study was this one in New York City. That was a very good study in that it included all charter schools in New York City. And probably the best evidence we have is from a national charter school study where they tried to go into many different states and recruit schools into a study, and but all of these schools had to be lottery-based studies. So this is kind of what I'm going to do in the paper, is kind of try to place these in a schematic that weighs both internal and external validity. And so I'll give you a little flavor of what this is about with this analysis. So the best studies we have in terms of internal validity are lottery-based analyses. Now, what does this mean? Well, it's a natural experiment based on a particular sample in a particular place. Students apply for admission to a charter school, and if there's more applicants than slots in a particular grade and year, then the school holds a lottery to randomly select students. And the comparison here is between lottery winners and lottery losers. And it's a nice design because arguably you've adjusted for the propensity to seek a different alternative. And you might worry that these kids, if there wasn't a lottery, might be more motivated, and you don't have a measure of motivation. So this is a nice way of kind of keep holding that constant. And the studies report, this gets kind of technical, either the intent to treat effect or the treatment on the treated effect. And here's what they find in general. Pretty positive results, right? So of these studies, 6 report positive and significant effects in both reading and math. 1 study shows insignificant results, and no study shows negative and statistically significant results. So we might conclude from the lottery-based analysis, which has the best internal validity, that we should be often running and support charter schools. However, many of these studies include 3 or fewer schools. There's only 2 that has, a larger sample. As I mentioned, one of the first lottery studies was New York City, which is a very large city, and it covered more than 70 schools in New York City, more than 95% or so of the charter school students in the city. So it didn't really cherry pick small numbers of schools. It chose all the schools in a large district. So I would say the external validity is pretty good here. It reports small positive effects in reading and math, much smaller than the studies on just a few schools. Almost all charters in New York City were oversubscribed and agreed to be part of the study. So really not a lot to complain about in terms of external validity, although we might question whether New York City charter schools are the same as charter schools in Denver or Phoenix or other places. Okay, the other study, which I mentioned, is the National Charter School Study. This study went into 15 different states, tried to recruit schools. Some of these charter schools were oversubscribed, some were not. Of course, it had to choose schools that were oversubscribed in order to put them in a lottery study. And all the schools had to agree to be studied. So it is interesting that as we kind of increase the sample size with these lottery studies, the results start to weaken, and in the most generalizable study, there are negative impacts, but not statistically different when they start correcting for multiple corrections. Okay, so the next set of studies are student fixed effects analyses. These exploit within student deviations and test scores, pre and post switching in or out of a charter school. Okay, so it's kind of a strange design. Sunny loves it. I love it. But you really need longitudinal data before and after an individual kid goes into or out of a charter school. And the data requirement is, is something to note. So you need longitudinal data from ideally an entire state or district. Many different scholars in many different areas have done studies on this, which is nice. And so this is what these studies find. 3 report positive and significant effects. 7 to 8 report basically effects that are very small and not different from 0. And 9 to 10 report negative and significant effects. So again, these studies have much better external validity. They're on many different types of charter schools, and they report more discouraging results than the lottery studies, especially those lottery studies on very few schools. The last method that I'm going to talk about are propensity score matching studies. And these match charter school students to one or more TPS students who are observationally similar on background characteristics and the most important thing, baseline test scores. And then the analyst computes estimates based on this matched sample. So this trims out kids, and it does not extrapolate to kids who are not similar based on these background characteristics. And the 500-pound gorilla in the room in charter school studies is called the Credo study out of Stanford. And it has amazing external validity. It covers 95% of all charter schools and all charter school students in the United States. It is only in 26 states in the District of Columbia, but that covers the vast majority. They didn't have to gain cooperation from charter schools, so there's no volunteer bias. They use administrative data for this. And it reports very small positive effect in reading, and I mean very, very, very small. They have such huge power that they can detect an effect of 0.01 or 0.02. And there's no effect in math. And there's another study of just one brand of no excuses charter schools called KIPP schools. And this reports large significant effects in reading and math, with math being slightly larger than reading. And this covers 41 schools in 13 states. So the Credo study has very high external validity, somewhat questionable internal validity. KIPP has very good external validity, many different states, but poor external validity in that it's only one type of charter school within the charter school type network, or it's only one type of charter school, and there's only volunteers in the KIPP study, so schools had to agree to be in the study. Okay, so what is my interpretation of this evidence? I think I differ slightly from the existing reviews out there. I think we can agree that there are large positive effects for one particular type of charter school, these no excuses charter schools. There's large positive effects from New York City charter schools from 10 years ago. It's not clear what the effects are now. The larger and more representative the sample, the smaller the effect. There's probably no positive or negative effect for the average student of charter schools relative to TPS. That's kind of my conclusion. But there's possibly positive effects for subgroups, for black students, Hispanic students, poor students, and students in urban areas. That's not something I had time to talk about today, but I hope to talk about in the paper. Okay, so what is the way forward, just to wrap up? First point. I think we should look at the within-study replication and validation literature. This is a methodological literature in evaluation science, which says that we can design quasi-experiments in such a way that we can often replicate randomized designs. And the lessons from this literature is that if we match locally in the same geographic region as the treatment students, if we match on a pretest, and if we include focal confounds that theory says are very important factors, under these conditions, the matching estimate approximates the experimental estimate. And this is, not just me saying this. This has been this kind of evaluation research has been done for many years, spearheaded by Tom Cook, who's in many of these studies. We have a paper coming out that's been advised by him on the early college high school project, and I am getting more and more comfortable with this idea. These are also, this kind of exercise has been done by many people who have done charter school research in particular. So they often will have an appendix where they say, it's interesting to note that yes, we have the lottery study, but we also can replicate this lottery impact estimate with a propensity score matching model as well. Or maybe they favor the propensity score matching model and then they use a lottery estimate to validate, the quasi-experimental design. So I think what I suggest that we do is trade off slightly lower internal validity for higher external validity. Because for policy purposes, we want studies with both high internal validity and high external validity. Because we can get errors, attribution errors, from either internal validity or external validity. So we should use carefully designed propensity score matching studies. It's also important to note that matching produces similar estimates to fixed effects, and as I said, lottery studies. We can also use this method for studies of elementary, middle, and high school outcomes. This literature is dominated by fixed effect studies of elementary and middle schools. We know very little about high school effects. And you can't use fixed effects methods for students always observed in a charter school or for point-in-time outcomes like graduation. Now, a very important thing to do is to figure out what happens if we don't have the baseline pretest, right? Or if we control for a pretest for an outcome like high school graduation or college enrollment. Is that sufficient to remove the bias or not? Okay, point 2, and this is my last point. We need to assess external validity somehow. We shouldn't just punt and say, we're waving our hands, we're giving up, there's nothing we can do, okay? In any randomized control trial or propensity score matching, you have the so-called Table 1, which is establishing baseline balance on observable characteristics. It's always done in any lottery study or any propensity score matching study. We can do the same thing for external validity. And I'm pointing to myself as well when, I'm thinking we should do this no matter what. We should have a Table 1 that shows that is kind of standard reporting requirements for convenience samples. We have so much administrative data now that we could assess the representativeness of our samples using basic descriptives on the analysis sample that we have and then population level data on charter schools in our state or charter schools in the country, including, if we can get it, baseline test scores if available. I think that would be a really important thing to do to give people a sense of where our studies stand with respect to external validity as well. Okay, I'm ready for questions now. Thank you.